Forgive me for not being visible right now. My camera is giving me fits today, but I am so excited to be with you. My name is Cherie Thomas, and I serve as one of the deputy directors for the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I am Markab Johannes. I use she, her pronouns. I am Cherie's counterpart, the other deputy director at the Michigan Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And we are a 75-member organization strong coalition that serves survivors of domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking throughout our great state of Michigan. If you have attended any of these webinars prior, you have probably met some of our colleagues. We always really love coming into community spaces and having great conversations with other folks who are serving different survivors and different people in community. And so, as Allison mentioned earlier, we really appreciate interactive webinars, and we make space for people's questions and sharing their experience and sharing their resources. So just a reminder, you are able to use the chat feature, or you are able to unmute your microphone and speak. You can raise your hand, whatever is most accessible to you today. And we will be able to ensure that we can include you in this conversation in the way that you'd like to be included. So having said that, Cherie, why don't we start this great conversation? I know we have about an hour and a half, and we want to be able to maximize all the time we have together.
Let's do it. All right. So everyone, as part of the welcome, Markab shared her pronouns. My pronouns are she, her as well. And I wanted to share with you a little bit of the why behind this work and why this particular topic for me. So if you look at my bio, you will see that in my undergrad, I did a concentration in women and disability studies. And I must admit that during that time, I felt super equipped and like I knew a whole lot of information and that I was a super advocate. And I actually learned a lot over time about humility in doing this work. And so while I learned a lot of information in my undergrad about working with those with disabilities, I also had to learn a lot about myself as a person who does not identify as living with a disability, and also as a person who loves and cares for people who do have both visible and invisible disabilities. And being a person who can be in space and recognize my role as someone who is aspiring to be an ally, and a person who recognizes that each space that I walk in, I have privilege. And so I do this work in order to ensure that those who have identities similar to mine, meaning those people who are not living with disabilities, do our best to not cause harm, do our best to maintain spaces of respect and dignity for those who we are serving, regardless of the identity and the way in which they present when we come in contact with one another. And so that's my why behind today. It's living into my truth and it's living into my value system. And it is me aspiring every day to be the best that I can be and do so with integrity. That's very important to me. And making sure that each time I show up, I am showing up willing to learn and willing to listen and acknowledge mistakes helps me in being an advocate in my service provision and in doing this work. Okay.
Thank you, Cherie. I think similar to you is over time in my career, I realized just how much I thought I knew, right? And how much I don't know that I don't know. And so I was very lucky that there were many people in community willing to share their experience and willing to share and educate me and provide resources to me, as well as other allies that were willing to have frank conversation around my own privilege as someone who does not identify with having a disability. And also to recognize that similar to Cherie, I do live and love people that have disabilities, and it's not the same ally and living with the identity of someone with a disability, and being able to know where and how can I support communities of people with disabilities, or individuals became really critical and important, because even within our work of serving survivors of who have experienced domestic violence, sexual violence, and human trafficking, we often find that many folks also have a disability and didn't share that part of that identity because of some of the things that we're going to talk about in terms of how we can be better and how we can improve and remain humble and have humility in our service provision. So take a moment to think about your why, why this particular webinar, right? Or why, what is your interest, or what is your reason? And everyone will come to this space for a different reason. And some folks hold this identity too. And so we want to recognize that when Cherie and I share, it is not the experience of every single person with a disability. And certainly this is just the beginning of you starting to explore your own knowledge, education, and how you're applying this knowledge to the service that you're giving. So take a moment and think about your own why.
All right. So today, Madcap and I have some very lofty goals. We have lots of things we're going to try and cover in this time frame. And I want to encourage all of you to, again, please ask questions or share any knowledge that you have. I do believe in experiential learning and shared knowledge and skill sets. And I know that Merkab and I have information that we're going to share, but I also believe that all of you have things that you can share with us as well, or share into the community at large. So for today, what we're going to do is we're going to work to gain a better understanding of disability rights. We're going to discuss disability pride and what it means to have it, how it looks like, how it manifests itself. We're going to talk about a lot of not holding this notion of a one-size-fits-all approach to anything. Most things are multifaceted, so we're going to talk about those things today. We're going to discuss the importance of using person first and identity first language. We're going to talk about and we're going to define ableism. We're going to give examples of ableist language. And we're also going to invite a discussion on how commonplace it is to use such language and what we can do as a community to not use that language and to recognize when we are engaging in it and stop it. And also creating equity, right? We're going to talk about creating equity in our service provision and also inclusion. We're going to talk about it from an intersectional framework. So when we talk about approaches to our service, our approach is intersectional. So that's where we're going to spend our time as we go through these terms and definitions.
And along the way, we'll share resources and knowledge of community organizations that are doing work. We also encourage you, if you have worked within your service provision with someone in your area, regionally, statewide or nationally, to please share that information, so that folks can know where they can further their education.
So when we talk about disability and disability rights, we want to recognize that disability rights seek to achieve equal opportunity for people with disabilities through the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act. When we're talking about a disability, we put a definition up here for you. It's any condition of the body or mind or an impairment that makes it more difficult for the person with the condition to do certain activities or activities with limitations and interact with the world around them, participation restrictions. And this includes, but isn't limited to, mobility, hearing, vision. And we want to make sure that we take the time to emphasize that there is absolutely nothing wrong with a person who is living with a disability. And the issue is our society. It's our society in and of itself creating an environment that is disabling. It's structurally designed to allow folks without disabilities to be able to participate and access activities without any limitations. So we want to take a moment and talk about some of the ways in which, on a day-to-day basis, we have learned and seen and have examples of spaces that have traditionally been disabling that are now more open. And I'll give you an example. I love to ride bikes. Bike riding is my favorite jam, which is why I'm super excited about spring leading into the summer, because I get to ride my bike. Now, one of the things that I know as a bike rider is that I'm not supposed to ride my bike on the sidewalk. I'm supposed to ride it in the street or, in bike lanes or in the park, different areas. One of the best things that ever happened was the lip that was cut out of the sidewalk. And for people who aren't living with disabilities, a physical disability in particular, may not be aware or note that that was created as an access point to allow for people who have physical impairments that require them to have assistive technology for mobility to be able to access utilizing sidewalks, crossing the streets without assistance from another person, to be able to do it themselves. But that also made it easier for everyone else. It also alleviated barriers for everyone else. Another example are the larger stalls in restrooms, where they created access for people to be able to enter into those spaces with their assistive devices without the need of someone else opening the door or holding the door or intruding into their own space. And it created greater access and space for everyone. It's a both and. And oftentimes when I've heard people talk about accessibility, instead of thinking about it as creating opportunities for all, they think about it as losing something or having something taken away or having to invest in something that doesn't benefit them. And so I want us all to challenge that ideology and really think about what it means to have a society that actually does operate for all people, that actually does create opportunity for all of us to be in space with one another, to consider the needs of all without thinking of it in a deficit mindset, but to actually think about it in an abundance mindset.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Cherie. Kind of reminds me of a conversation I was having recently, where so it was around designated parking spots, right? It was a couple weeks ago, maybe, where I am in the state, was The weather was terrible. It was very cold, lots of snow, wind. And we parked in a parking lot and we're entering a store. And I heard two people say, well, I think that in the wintertime, we should be able to park in the accessible spaces. Because why do we have to walk longer? Especially during bad weather, right? So it's this idea, like you said, Cherie, of how do we see that happening, right, in our everyday? How do we hear this model of it's taking away from me because it's giving to somebody else? And how then do we decide to interrupt those narratives so that we can say, actually, it's ensuring that everybody, we don't have to think twice, because one of the things around privilege you have if you don't have a disability is not having to really worry or think about or strategize or be concerned or about where to park a vehicle. And so it's switching our mindset, not only switching our mindset, but being prepared to say, how do we interrupt a narrative when we hear someone saying, if someone else gets access to something, that means I'm not getting access to something, which isn't true, right? There's a whole other parking lot full of parking spaces. And really in this parking lot, which was rather big, there were maybe 6 parking spots that were reserved for people who needed accessible parking.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that example that you just shared. And one of the things that I find that people are oftentimes unaware of are the many ways in which disability can present itself. So when you're given an example of the parking lot, I've been in the stores and going in the stores and listening to people make commentary on things that they're making assumptions about based off of an outward appearance of a person. So all disability is invisible. And you may have someone who is parking right there in those accessible spots who may not have a visible disability. And when you see that, it gets questioned frequently, right? So I want us to take a moment and consider and think about, as we're going through this, how many times have we witnessed, just in our own lives, people who are questioning the existence of a disability because they can't see it for themselves. And it makes it really difficult for people who are living with invisible disabilities to seek support, to ask for support, when we're all getting these messages about something being wrong if someone can't recognize it readily for themselves. So invisible disabilities are specific illness or conditions like psychiatric disabilities, traumatic brain injuries, diabetes, chronic fatigue syndrome, learning disabilities, attention deficit disorder. These are just a few of those things. And when a person is living with one of these disabilities, depending on how our services are set up, it may have an unintended impact of having a person feel as if they have less of a right to support than a person with a visible disability. So as service providers, it is our job and it's our responsibility to mitigate that, to create an environment where a person who is living with a disability, be it visible or not visible, that we're creating space for a person to share what they want to share with us in order for them to receive our services in a way that makes sense for them. in a way that allows them to engage and receive the services in the fullness in which they were designed.
Yeah. Cherie, so a lot of people say, so what is my starting point, right? As a service provider, we often put more emphasis on ensuring that our physical space is accessible, which is okay. It's fine, right? We don't want to say using one strategy is better than the other. We do have a lot of emphasis that is guided by laws, right? And acts that say, okay, your ramp has to be at this degree, your doors have to be, the width have to be so much, you know, you have to have accessible restrooms. The challenge is that the ADA is just, it's the minimum that your organization has to meet, right? It's not the potential of everything that we can do to ensure that we are accessible to folks with disability. And there is an emphasis on folks with physical disability. And there's, in our societies, there's not a lot of thought about what about invisible disabilities? Can people with invisible disabilities also access our services? And what will that look like in tandem with whatever it is we're also doing to ensure physical accessibility to our services? And then the third thing to think about is the laws and ADA and things like that just tell us what is the minimum expectation. And often the minimum is the minimum, right? There is more that we can do if we're intentional about it. But the first and good starting place is to say, when someone tells us they have a disability, if the sentence starts with but, if, show, then we're not believing. We're questioning someone's disability. And we start to question disability because it's based on our own prejudice, our own stereotypes, perhaps even our own understanding of what is it? What does a disability mean? And so when we start to challenge those things, or if we catch ourselves questioning, well, they're not using an assistive device, they're not a wheelchair user, I don't see them with a cane or anything else, how can they have a disability? The truth is, they don't have to share the type of disability that they have, only that they have a disability. And we prepare so that with that, the same way that we talked about that parking lot, so that folks can access our service without even having to say, I have a disability, because we are prepared to serve everybody.
I so love that you said that we're prepared to serve everyone. I had a conversation at a training last week about what does it take to create a welcoming environment. And one of the best ways that I've experienced in entering a space and feeling welcomed was having that space already be prepared for my presence. What does that mean? That means, one, a scent-free environment is important for me. Kev, you know this, I have horrible allergies, horrible. I'm allergic to everything under the sun, except for the sun. I love the sun.
The sun is probably the thing that counters your allergies.
Yes, right, right. And so, but with that in mind, going into environments that are automatically scent-free because someone somewhere recognizes that scents can induce migraines. You know, they can also induce other reactions for people that are debilitating. Thinking about these things on the forefront, right? Versus someone having an adverse reaction in the room. And now we're trying to mitigate it and ask people to go scrub or take something off is an important part of creating that environment. And it then leaves that person without the need to disclose that this is an issue for them because the environment is already created, right? One of the things that I noticed happened just during our time now is someone put in a copy of the PowerPoint automatically without someone having to ask for it, right? So again, another point of accessibility in this space alone by making sure that the document itself is accessible to those who need a copy of it for themselves versus in this webinar space right on the screen. Font size. Madhukar, I think I shared with you many moons ago. I used to make the busiest presentations you've ever seen in your life with all of the flashing bling and everything, things screaming and oozing out of the screen because I thought it was exciting and I liked it and it was cool. Unintended consequences, right? Creating a PowerPoint, a training that was not fully accessible, that actually created harm in the process. And so, again, when we're thinking about what are we doing, how are we creating a space that is open, that is welcoming, that does say our services are available to all on the forefront, there's a lot that we can do in the beginning.
Yeah. A proactive versus a reactive, right?
Yes.
Approach. And the other myth that we'd like to bust here is that it's super expensive to create accessible environments. It's not. It's about having options and creating options. You know, low lighting might be appreciated by folks who require low lighting because they want a low stim situation.
Mhm.
Higher lighting might be requested for folks who might have visual acuity issues or need more lighting to see. That's the difference of perhaps a lamp, a flashlight, you know, and these are really low cost things, but having those things available, things with different textures, it means, you know, we create sensory boards with things that you can buy or get from like a dollar store, you know, things that are smooth, things that are rough, things that are curved. And this can help with things like anxiety potentially, or with disabilities that are supported by some sensory interaction. It means, you know, being able, someone is challenged with dexterity, which is a physical disability. It means perhaps having a thicker pen or pencil for if they're filling out forms, or an iPad, or any of these things. So it's a matter of, and that's, you know, we can't really walk through a process, but there are organizations that can support you in creating a plan to evaluate your services. Cherie, if you don't mind, I'd like to just really give a plug now for MDRC,
Yes.
who can do that. So it's the Michigan Disability Rights Coalition, and they are statewide. And part of their services is to support agencies, and I'll put that information in chat as well, or maybe Cherie can help me put that in chat while I'm sharing a little bit about their work. Is what they can do is help you through either a self-guided toolkit or through some technical assistance, support walking through various areas of your service provision to do an analysis, or to look at ways in which you can make spaces more accessible. Additionally, what they have is they have a great loan bank for so many tech equipment, everything from outdoor equipment to technology. So if you want to see in my service provision, is it more accessible if I have an iPad for folks to do an intake, for example? Before making that investment, you can do a long-term borrow from their loan bank as an organization. So MDRC is a great organization as a resource, and they will help connect you with local organizations and agencies in your area that do disability rights, as well as support folks with disabilities.
So Mudkeb, I put into the chat the information for MDRC.
Thank you.
So I want to start us out in having a conversation about ableism. And I believe most of us would like to believe we don't participate in any of the isms. And I want us to think about how the isms show up and what they are. So when we're talking about ableism, we're talking about the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. So I want us to think about that for a moment, right? That ableism is the discrimination of and social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical abilities are superior. And this is the part I think that may have us in our feels a little bit. That at its heart, ableism is rooted in the assumption that disabled people require fixing, and it defines people by their disability. Now that's a big statement. It's a big thing to actually have to reconcile with, because we have to take a pause and think about our own interactions with people who are living with disabilities. What has been our go-to in our interactions? What have been our thought process around engaging with people who are living with disabilities? And if we actually stop and take a pause and be honest, honest conversations with ourselves, I believe firmly are the first step in actually creating a just society and actually creating equity, because it actually allows for us to do that internal wrestling with ourselves and our belief systems and where it came from, and undo it if we find that it's actually causing harm to others or has the potential to cause harm for others.
We'd love to hear from folks around this, because Cherie, you're right. It seems icky sometimes, right? Because I can think back and say, you're right. There have been times where I've thought, I have to fix, I have to help, right? Statements like, I can help this be better. And there is an ickiness in the feeling of saying, was that ableist? Or realizing yes, I engaged in ableist behavior, or I engaged in this social attitude, this norm that we have around how we think about disability in a way that harmed somebody or harmed people. And it's not a good feeling, right? And we'll talk about what do we do, but the first thing we need to do is actually say, do I engage in ableism?
Yes. Or have I engaged in ableism? Mhm. One of the things I know about the isms is that we all get the message about them. We all receive within the society messages that other people. And if we don't hold a particular identity, we get a message that says we're better than. And if we do hold a particular identity, we often feel harmed, right? The difference between having privilege and a marginalized identity and oppression. So right now we're opening it up and we are inviting you all in to join in this discussion and share with us about times in which ableism showed up for you in your service provision.
So feel free to put something in chat. You are welcome to raise your virtual hand or you can
Anessa?
unmute your mic.
Lisa? I'm sorry.
That's
Anessa?
okay.
I'm here. So one of the things that I didn't realize was ableism that is like that over optimism about somebody getting better or being healthy. I work at community mental health. And so we see many levels, usually the sickest in the community. And that ableism can be, I have to check myself because sometimes I want to push harder than they want to go or that they can go. And so it's always a balancing act. And I'm always checking myself to make sure that I'm where they want to be and not where I see that they could be or not where I want them to be, but staying, marching with them, marching next to them and along with them, as opposed to pushing or tugging.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you,
That's
Anessa.
a beautiful example of recognizing. And you gave a two-part example, right? An example of when ableism shows up and then recognizing when it shows up. Because when we recognize it, we can choose to do something differently. Thank you.
Anessa, I also appreciate that a little bit of that is a conversation around your intent, right, is to be supportive, but the impact of that response of pushing, not meeting folks where they are, is really impacting them differently, right? Potentially harmfully.
Yeah, I'm gonna have that intent versus impact, right? Oftentimes we have very good intentions. The impact may be something other than that.
There's something in chat I'd like to read. I have unfortunately been on temporary disability through ADA myself. Hearing that people want to, quote, fix you is hard. Now seeing it on the other end, I still find myself saying that to others accidentally, although now I correct myself quickly. Thank you, Lisa or Lisa. I'm not sure how you say your name, but thanks for sharing that into space.
Yes, absolutely. Monica, this is one of the discussions that you and I have had on a multitude of times in which you're experiencing something yourself and you know the harm of it. And then in another role or in another position, you can inadvertently find yourself doing the same thing that you know, right, that has caused harm to you. But then to your point, I believe, Lisa, is that you can recognize it and change it quickly. One of the things I want us all to be aware of, this is not a journey of perfection. Perfection does not exist. You are going to make mistakes along the way, and it's how you deal with those errors that's extremely important.
Yeah. We'll still hold space for folks who want to unmute their microphone and share. Oh, great. I see a hand up. Go ahead, Tegan. Oh, we don't. I see your hand raised. Are you able to? I don't know. All right, Jeremy, why don't we go with you, and then Tegan, please. We can't hear you, so. Oh,
Okay. Can you hear me?
yes, Jeremy, we hear you.
Yeah. So I really like this training so far because I've been a paraplegic since I was around 10 years old. And I was always taught that just because I had a disability didn't mean I couldn't do things. So sometimes I tend to, when I'm working with clients, I try to always be cautious of the way that I was raised and what I was told, because it's not always correct, because I may be able to do things where they may not. But the way I was raised and what was instilled in me makes that difficult sometimes.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you for sharing that, your lived experience. Yes, as an ally, then and other folks, it's a good reminder, right, that often in societies and communities, we also talk about disabilities as a monolith, right? Like one group that's experiencing the same experiences, right? That have the same needs, that have the same access to service, right? Unfortunately, Cherie and I are in spaces where people say, well, I worked with one person who was a wheelchair user, and therefore I know that this will work for everybody, right? Or one person that had needs for vision, and so this will work for everybody. And that in itself, right, is ableist, right? This notion or this belief that everybody requires the same support services or has the same feelings and approaches or has the same lived experiences, it really then invisibilizes, right, and further isolates and further creates inequities for people, when that in our minds that narrative doesn't fit for everybody. Then what we tend to do is we tend to then question, well, then do they actually really truly have a disability?
Thank you, Madcap. We have some things in the chat.
Yes.
So I'm going to start. This is from Adrian. I have had to learn to be a good listener when someone points out something to my bias. I would get defensive because I didn't want someone to think I saw them differently. I have had to understand that these are opportunities to learn and grow. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. That has been a growing point for me as well, that I do have bias. One of the things that helped me is recognizing that everyone has bias, and that bias in and of itself is not a bad word, but it is a recognition that we have information that we've gotten somewhere along the way. Sometimes bias is this natural way of ordering things, right? That's one way in which bias shows up. But then there's another way in which that natural ordering gets funneled through stereotypes and myths and misinformation. And then it becomes rooted as a part of who we are. And we start making decisions based off of those things. And then we unintentionally cause harm to people. But when we can recognize it, and you're going to hear me say this again before this is all over today, we can do something differently about it. We don't have to keep making the same errors over and over again. We get to choose differently, which is what makes me so excited about doing work through an intersectional framework, is that we have an opportunity to do things differently. There's so much information and knowing ways of being that I had to unlearn because it just didn't connect with who I was striving to be as a human, as a way in which I engage with the world and how I want to impact the world as I move through it, right? I want to be a person that is in service to justice. In order to do that, I have to recognize any space in which I can cause harm. And that means looking at my privileges.
Exactly. And going back, right, even to the definition we shared earlier, Cherie, it's going back to say why, questioning, right? And you gave a great sentence here, Adrian. You said, I saw them differently. I didn't, because I got defensive because I didn't want someone to think I saw them differently. So the fact is we're all different from one another, right? And where I often challenge my own thinking is, I see Cherie differently than I. The difference when I'm practicing an ableism or an ableist language is that there is a value system that we've put on different people with different identities, including people with disabilities. And so the difference I see is that value statement I've put on them or a community based on what Cherie said, based on all these things that we've learned, that I've learned over time. And so over time, we've also learned that different is bad, right? But what we've really learned is different is bad when we have an internal or societally based or supported value system of people or communities.
So we have another chat, Madcap.
Yes.
Thank you, Tegan, for taking the time to type this out. I think it's important to note that not everyone with a disability wants to have that disability be at the center of their assistance or identity. People can have multiple layers of identity, disabled and queer, and may not need assistance for one of those identities or may not even want to focus on it. I have had to make sure I listen to what the client want assistance with, not with what I want to help them with. Yes. Yes. Thank you for lifting that up. That is one of the things that we talk about, particularly when we talk about service provision. What is that person identifying as what they're looking for assistance with? And again, that requires us to check ourselves. How are we moving about? How are we engaging with the people that we're serving, that we're supposed to be serving? Are we allowing them to share with us what is most salient for them? Or are we automatically jumping to a conclusion that is other than what is going to be most important for them? And when we're doing that, we can actually close doors to communication.
Yeah. Absolutely. And closing doors to communication, again, could be, we all know when ists and isms exists, right? The more identities, marginalized identities that folks hold, we see that the access to resources or the access to doors being open to them or services available to them, really, it's fewer and fewer. And so yet we become one more resource that's not accessible to somebody. And by not recognizing that listening is, and we go through some of the skills, and I don't want to jump ahead a little bit, but this group is fantastic in that some of the things you're talking about, considering intersectionality, meaning how does someone with multiple identities, including someone with a disability, how do they experience systems, and how do systems treat them? We'll talk about that a little bit later. And also listening, right? And that being one of the foundational ways in which we do our work, regardless of if you're in housing, mental health, or, you know, survivors of DV or SV, anytime we're engaging with people who hold marginalized identities, the core is listening. We don't know everything, and we don't know what we don't know. And so Cherie picked this on the screen, Cherie.
Mhm.
I really like this. This is such a good reminder of kind of, and to summarize what we've been talking about just for the last few minutes. And certainly if other folks want to share, please unmute your microphone or raise your hand or put something in chat. We have some time for more perspective, but I want to talk about this. This is I believe, Cherie, you got this from a site. Is it Autistic and Trying?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, great. I know I read it and I don't have my note there, but it talks about, like, even, you know, if we think about our social norms, right, or our norms that are prevalent thoughts and stereotypes around folks with a diagnosis of autism. And often here we say, oh, okay, what is the norm when I think about the first time I thought about autism, or if I were to serve someone with autism, society thinks, and then here on the left is, I feel nothing, just like a rock, right?
Mhm.
That's often a prevailing, and it's wrong. It's a stereotype, right? And what I actually feel is all the feelings, which is in this right side of this diagram. And so somewhere, somehow, you might fall on this spectrum of, based on what you think you know, or what you've been taught, or what you've heard. And so if I come in with that prejudice or with that stereotype, thinking, if I work with someone and they share with me their diagnosis, then, and my starting point is they can have no feelings, or they don't share their feelings, then that's a very ableist, rooted in ableism way of me to start my interaction with this individual. And it limits my ability to be an advocate. It further harms someone who is engaging with me, and it isolates, it closes opportunities and resources and doors. Imagine all the things that I might choose to share or not share based on this assumption. You know, imagine how I might discriminate how I engage with them around talking about feelings, if that was my starting place. So perceiving what a person feels or thinks or needs or wants, right? And starting that from that place can be really, really harmful. And so what are some things that we can actively do to ensure, right, that we're always testing our perceptions, our prejudice, our stereotypes. And it's going to look different for everybody. Cherie, I don't know if you have things when in your learning process that have worked for you, but I think everyone's individual, right? But what are some things that you do as a practice?
That's a great question, Madcap. So this actually, if you will go ahead, this leads us really nicely into our next slide,
Okay.
which is on intersectionality, because this is where I actually get into my practice. And one of it was recognizing that I did indeed have privilege. So remember early on when I talked about how much I thought I knew early on when I first started my work and getting my education, and I learned so much about people who were living with disabilities. And even though I had the formal education, and even though I have lots of people in my life who I love who are living with disabilities, it did not mean that I did not still have privilege in other areas that then impacted my engagement in the way that I was actually providing services and engaging with the people that I love, to be honest, who were living with disabilities. And I had to really think about, what does this mean? All of the identities that I hold as an individual, the areas in which I experience oppression and the areas in which I experience privilege, how are they interplaying in my engagement as I'm doing my work? And so one of the things that I do, Macab, is I work really hard to, on a regular basis, do a self-inventory. I work really, really hard to do that. And when I say I work really, really hard to do that, I mean that I have the privilege of choosing to do it. And I don't take that lightly. And that was a hard thing for me to reconcile with, Murkab, is that I had the privilege to choose.
Yeah.
So let's talk to them about intersectionality for a moment.
Yeah.
So
go ahead, Cherie. It's harder when I don't
when we can't see
your smiley. Yes, your smiley face is not on the screen. No, please start. Please go on.
Because I'm cheesing her right now.
Right.
All right. So for those of you who may not be aware, intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And when she did so, she actually did so to illustrate the multi-layered oppression that women of color face. She was actually in litigation. She was supporting a group of women of color who were experiencing employment discrimination. So I'm going to move forward because that's a long story, but I want to get to the gist of it, which is intersectionality shows how different power structures interact in the lives of people who hold marginalized identities. Okay. For our discussion, I want us to recognize that within all of these identities, and this is not an all-encompassing list either, okay? Does not list every identity that a person can hold. But for the purpose of our discussion, when we're discussing disability, I want to remind folks that disability or our ability can change and shift over time or in an instant. And I think that may help us in our own space of working to hold more space for people who don't share the same identities that we do, or who may have a shared identity, but in a different type of way. So when we talk about ability status, it encompasses a broad range, right? And we went over some of those, the physical, the mental, developmental, right? And then how our society in and of itself is disabled, It's how our systems are upheld by ableist norms and structures that allow for this to persist. We have been brought up in a society that has determined and set a standard for what has been deemed a norm and what is not. And we all operate and move in it as it was designed. And it is not until we learn something new, until that information has been interrupted in some sort of way, that we recognize it is so much more complex than that, and that there is not one way of being, and that because my vision and what I need to see may be different from yours, my hearing and what I need to hear may be different from yours, how I need to move about the world may be different from yours, does not make yours superior to mine or vice versa. It is multi-layered. And when we recognize it, when we can understand that, we can see where we have privilege in those spaces and also work to minimize marginalizing and oppressing others. So when Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term, she did it to show where power comes and it collides, where it interlocks and intersects. And as service providers, what are we doing in our service provision? How are we being strategic? How are we finding opportunities to destigmatize identity? Like, that's huge. Like, what are we doing to actually create space where the people that are coming to us for services don't feel stigmatized when entering our doors for services? Yes, categories create division.
Yeah. Thank you,
And,
Shannon.
and here's the word gets complex, right? It's a twofer. Twofer is one of my favorite words because yes, and there's nothing wrong with difference. And I'll give you an example, and you all can't see me, but I'm a Black woman. And when people share with me that they don't see my Blackness, one, it doesn't feel truthful. If they're having a conversation with me and they can tell me that my dress is pretty, or that they like my red glasses or my blue French manicure, I'm going to say they can notice that I'm a Black woman or that I am of the melanated population of people. And to deny that fact about who I am is to take away something that is very important to how I live life. And it doesn't allow room for me to share the ways in which this part of my identity is impacted by systems. And so it is a twofer.
Thank you, Cherie. Kaylin, you put in chat, I think the best way to create the space is to try and get to a better understanding of their shared categories. And the best way to do this is to simply talk to them about their experiences and not try to ignore any particular part of who they are. I really appreciate this. Thank you, Kaylin. So the whole idea, right, when we talk about intersectionality, and it's kind of also tied to what I believe it was Tegan said earlier, right, when they talked about the multiple layers of identity and the examples are given having a disability and being queer. People to talk about themselves as whole people, right? How all their identities, when they come together, Cherie shared, she's Black and she's a woman. Those two things are true. And her identities of experiencing her Blackness and her womanness in whatever through systems, right, happen together. She just doesn't get to experience one thing about the one identity. Her whole self is always moving, is always present. And so when and if we ignore one part of someone's identity, right, or we discount the impact, or we don't believe what that person is experiencing because of that identity, then we will never be able to invite someone to talk to us about their experiences as a whole person. And in our specific conversation, what experiences they're experiencing as a person with a disability who also holds other identities.
Yes, Madcap. And that gets us to these very important questions, right? When we're providing services to people, as service providers, we are making decisions. Now, in theory, these decisions should be following a process that is an objective process. For example, who gets to know about all of the services that we offer? Who gets notified about opportunities that exist when those opportunities are limited? For those of us who provide shelter space, who's exited and what is the criteria for those exits? How is discretion utilized? When we're making assumptions, when we're making decisions that are rooted in bias, when we aren't aware of our own relationship to ableism, we make decisions that unintentionally cause harm. Madcap, I am a firm believer that the majority of people who enter service provision aren't entering it to intentionally harm people, that they truly want to serve folks and they enter into specific realms of service provision because there's a connection somewhere.
I agree with you. So those are, you know, and the question I posed to Cherie is, how do we start this work, or what have you done in your journey, right? And it could go back to what we can do is go back to starting to ask these questions, right? I'll put the questions in chat, that the ones that Cherie shared, right? Who gets offered services? Who knows of all the services that we offer? Who gets notified when opportunities are limited? Who gets exited? And what is that criteria? And then how discretion is utilized? So we make multiple decisions a day, right? Regardless of what organization and agency that you work with. Part of the journey of addressing ableism as individuals and as an organization, communities, and society is to start thinking and honestly responding around the answers to these questions. And they're universal, so they will fit, right? Regardless of the work that you're doing. So this is a good start. Start questioning these things. So please feel free to continue to give us input. Even if we haven't posed a specific question, we would love to hear from folks in chat, or also just raise your hands or unmute your mic. So Cherie, I know we talked a little bit about access to service earlier, right?
Yeah.
We identified the physical access, right, to sometimes with a building, right? And we kind of focused largely on, we gave examples related to physical barriers that might exist for folks. And so we want to start thinking broader, right? Even beyond the physical barriers, right? There's barriers of communication. And we think, are those inviting or not, right? Representation is important. If someone is not seeing images of people who look like them, is that a barrier? Do we have policies and procedures that limit, deny, or isolate or invisibilize people with disabilities?
You know, Madcap, you just said something really important about, when am I able to see someone? Are there images that are reflective of me? And I want us to be mindful that when Madcap is bringing that into space, we're talking about more than just posters and pictures. We're talking about people providing the services who are representing the community as a whole. Because those things are important, you know, and again, you know, one of the things that I've learned over time is that when you create an environment that is actually welcoming, you learn things about the people that you employ. And not everyone upon employment is going to share with you that they hold particular identities. One, because of some of the things that we've been talking about before, this stigma that comes with people knowing about, you know, invisible disabilities that you may have, or people having fears and beliefs about how you may or may not show up when they have information about these identities. And I want us to really think about, what are we doing to create an inclusive workplace that also serves the people that we're serving as well?
Yeah. Sure, and I think the biggest thing we can talk about is, so earlier I said, you know, I gave the referral to MDRC, the Michigan Disability Rights Coalition. It is impossible to talk about the challenges, the barriers, the successes that folks with disabilities experience or have without engaging with community who experience disability. It's not including folks with disability in these conversations is often how people go around trying to improve their services or understand, right? They exclude the voices of those with the expertise, of those with the lived experience, of those that are most knowledgeable of their own lives and experiences. And we want to insert, right, what we think we know. And so part of when we're saying access to service, yes, we have the ADA that might be able to guide us on the legal requirements. We can think of ways to say, how do we make our space more accessible? How do we ensure that our policies aligned? But these conversations cannot happen without communities that advocate or folks that have disabilities. It is trying to build services and access to services without the input of those that use the services.
I really appreciate you bringing that into the space, Midcap, and that's another one of those areas in which we cause unintentional harm. Like we hear the message and then we go forward, but we didn't stop to include the people who were going to be impacted, the people that we are intending on serving. And that's a really important aspect of how we do our work.
Yeah.
You create inclusion with inclusion. And that also requires trust building too. Trust is earned. Show up and listen. Hear where you may have erred. Hear where you have done things well. Hear where there is room to grow. Find out those spaces that collaboration can truly exist.
And it can't be after fact, right? Or afterthought, where you say, oh, good, we got a committee here, we've done our research, we've reached out, we know this and this. Well, oh, wait a minute. We didn't ask those that are being impacted after the fact. Let's invite that voice in. That's also very ableist. And so it has to be a conversation from the beginning. But the work is for those that aspire to be allies with those who have disability, to say, hey, where's my role? What is my job to build, to earn the trust and to understand and learn?
Right. So Midcap, we've spent a lot of time because it's integrated into all the things, right? About spacing. But we talk specifically for those of you who are operating a shelter-based space, what that inclusion looks like. Midcap gave us great examples already about the ADA requirements of wheelchair accessibility. I talked about the cuts in the sidewalk, automatic doors, elevators, and all of those things. What are some other ways in which we can create spaces that are already ready for people who are utilizing our spaces? Are the beds in common spaces and areas already ADA accessible? Handicap, I know you're aware that I ran a shelter-based program before. And unfortunately, it was after the fact, after we had someone who needed a bed that was accessible, that we got one, which meant for a while, our services that we provided were not the best of services because we were building as we were serving. And my encouragement to all of you is to really do an assessment, as Midcap said, connect with a service provider who does this, who already understands. Have an assessment done. And also, I believe in paying people for their services. Don't ask for it for free. Pay people for their knowledge and their expertise. And have an assessment done. And find out what you can do better to create spacing that says, yes, you truly are welcomed here. It's not an afterthought. All are truly welcome here. Midcap already talked to us about the doorways being wide enough. And I'm not going to ignore that some buildings are historic buildings and they are exempt from ADA requirements. And again, Mutkev said it best. That's minimal. And just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. And what I mean by that is because we can get away with not being accessible doesn't mean that we should. Like, what can we actually do? What is the values that we want to live into? Yes, we can add the company that does assessments again. Yes.
And if they don't, Stacy, they can also guide you to folks that in your area that do that. So autonomy and choice, and we've talked about this a little bit throughout the presentation, but we want to talk about that folks with particularly invisible disabilities, they may have not ever requested or received accommodations, right? Because they might experience what it is to pass as someone without a disability, right? And they might continue to try to pass as someone without a disability for as long as possible, because this means that they can attempt to avoid some of the barriers that we talked about, but barriers, attitudinal barriers, right? These barriers that we create because society has created these attitudes that create value systems on people, right? And from a place of fear of what will happen if I disclose my disability, or if someone finds out I have a disability. And the choice to disclose or not disclosed can be a choice for someone. And when they make that choice not to disclose, it's to avoid being marginalized or experiencing that harm. It comes, lots of folks have shared that comes with feelings of stress or harm, shame, right? Or all of these other attitudes that community and society says folks should have, right? One of the things that we talk about, right, is options and choices. So folks can make those choices. Asking about accommodations more than one time, right? People have the right to change their mind later when they engage with you, or perhaps when you've earned their trust more. And taking the time to earn that trust is really, really important. Offering accommodations, being honest and upfront and forthright around what's available and what's not available, right? Understanding that you and I and Cherie and people in this space are using the word accommodation because in our industries, we use that term and we generally know what it means, but really saying, what could it be? Because we also know that folks could have different language ability, or their understanding could be different. And so really thinking about how do we do that? Phrasing questions in different ways. Avoid using jargon, right? Just because we use fancy words around our understanding doesn't make us better, right? Just being, what do they need? Saying, hey, what do you need? And then being forthright around whether you can provide that. If a person does disclose an invisible disability, we continue to with that advocacy, right? And saying they still have choices, right? We still respect choices that people have, the autonomy, the decision, right? As someone said alongside earlier, they talked about meeting people where they are instead of saying, I'm going to decide for you. That's what we mean. And also recognize that they hold many, many identities. And so these are just the beginnings of how do we think this through? How do we ensure that we are providing autonomy and choice with people who have invisible disabilities in particular?
You know, this is one of my favorite phrases. Like,
Mhm.
words have meaning. I love words. I love playing with words. I love putting words together. And I also recognize the power that words have. And so, with that being said, we've been utilizing throughout our time today person first language. So, person first language puts the person before the disability and describes what a person has and not who a person is, right? So, a person who is living with a disability, individuals with disabilities, right? That's what we've been talking about today. And I want to also recognize that there is identity first language. And identity first language is language that leads with the person's diagnosis, such as a disabled person. I bring this to us to recognize that people get to choose. We can't be the deciders for them. And it is best to ask each person the language that they prefer to use. Find out what the community itself is using, what's best for that community when you're engaging with that community. And also, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish too, right? When we're talking about if we're in a community meeting or a community space and we're trying to create opportunity and space for everyone to engage, what are our goals that we're seeking to achieve? That's going to determine the language that we're utilizing in the space and hearing from the people that we're serving, because there are pros and cons to each. And we want to be mindful that those of us who are not living with a disability, we don't get to choose for people who are. Choice is always at the forefront. And part of this also goes into, when we talk about our language, not unintentionally causing harm. One of the ways in which we unintentionally cause harm are using things called microaggressions. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the term microaggression, a microaggression is an everyday verbal or behavioral slight, and it causes someone to feel an insult, an injury, because it's related to their identity. And for our purposes, we're talking about ableism right now, right? And those slights happen right in front of everyone. And it causes the person that is feeling that to wonder if it's just them. Because everyone else around is saying nothing and doing nothing. And this is when we're talking about that language that we use so commonly that is ableist. So one of the things that I hear quite frequently, particularly living here in Michigan, is comments about the weather. I've heard people say many times the weather is bipolar. Weather is not bipolar. Bipolar is an actual diagnosis. However, that is a microaggression. It is a slight. It is harmful, yet it's language that is utilized in our common day conversations. Medicap, how many times have we heard people just generally say, that's so crazy? Or they have said to people, I used the example earlier when people said they don't see my Blackness, when people have said to other people, I don't think about you as being disabled. Those are microaggressions, and those things cause harm. And we want to be mindful that we aren't engaging in those behaviors. And when we recognize them, when we see them, that we actually take the time to call our colleagues in or call our friends and family in, so that we aren't participating end that harm.
Yeah.
Not saying anything is still participating when we recognize that it's happening. Now, Metcalf, we have 2 minutes.
We do, and you know what, Shannon put something, has had their virtual hand up. So I'd like to just take a minute, Shannon, if you'd like to unmute your mic, that's great. And then Lisa Fuller, you put in chat, you work at Disability Network Southwest Michigan. Thank you very much that we've been spot on with words and explanations and testimonies and examples. Thank you for sharing that you offer community education on ableism, disability rights, intersectionality with a website on there. Thank you so much for sharing that resource, Lisa. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I just wanted to kind of provide some insight on some things, and also that I am somebody with disabilities. So I've been greatly impacted by our benefits and resources that the government administrates in their agencies, in the organizations. For example, here in Grand Rapids, I was forced to be placed in the downtown area through the homeless system. And so I'm forced to pay for parking. Now, the parking here, they have some ADA compliancy, but they are not fully ADA compliant to consider people with intellectual disabilities or mental health disabilities as anxiety or ADHD that cannot keep track of every 2 hours of parking, which creates a perpetuity of tickets on top of it. Now, through my oversight, I realized that the city here was fraudulently charging for holiday parking because they weren't reporting the holiday schedule to the app developer. Which they incite that they still are going to keep that money, and that's like $81,000, even though the comp controller has told them to return it. When we can't even get our government officials, our commission body, our elected officials to come to the table to address these things and fix these deficiencies so that people can be successfully homeless, exit out of the homeless system, you know, it really is kind of the whole tone when you try to engage a lot of your representatives or your organizations or your stakeholders. They really only want to address to a degree of what our rights are being violated, and then they have bar members that are constantly telling them that they're allowed to be entitled to interpret and do these types of things to people. So I would implore everyone in their capacity to write your representatives in your city and get together with your organizations when you see these types of things and speak out, because they are trying to block and deny these things getting fixed. And it shouldn't be this difficult to fix these things. And also the judicial branch, they, with probate court, right now I'm doing oversight for that right now to fix the deficiency for honest services and the perpetuity of monopolies that they contract with other organizations and corporations to continue to harm people and their families and tear them apart. And it's not equitable. So thank you for your time. I know I took up a lot.
Thank you. No, thank you so
appreciate
much. Thank you, Shannon, for sharing your lived experience and for your call to action. There certainly is space for those organizations to work with individuals, but also to do advocacy on a larger scale in systems through the different systems that you mentioned. So thank you. That is a good reminder that our advocacy can be as expansive as we are able to make it for both individuals and within communities and in systems. We appreciate you. Cherie,
That's our time. Thank
that's
you
our
so much.
time. Yes. Thank you
Thank you
folks
for
very
having us.
much.
We really appreciate having the opportunity to share with you and be in space with you today. And I hope that you found this time meaningful.
Yes, our contact information is available to you. We are always open to hearing and sharing, continuing this discussion outside of this webinar. We hope everyone has a fantastic rest of the week, and we're optimistic for some spring weather.
I second that. Thank you so much for your time and your knowledge, Cherie and Merkab. I also want to thank Eric, who was helping with tech stuff from Micah in the chat. We did post the PowerPoint, so you should have been able to grab that. If not, reach out. I wanted to thank all our participants again. There will be a survey that pops up on the screen. If you could fill that out, that helps me know what kind of trainings to plan for you all, and it also helps our speakers know how you enjoyed their presentation. So we would really appreciate it if you could do that. We have one free training a month, and if this was helpful to you, please consider becoming a MICA member. That is how we are able to provide all of these, is through our memberships.